Well, there we have it. The writing is on the wall. Today is our final installation of the Spooky Sermons series that we've had going on leading up to Halloween. And so with Halloween now in the rearview mirror, this series has to come to an end, unfortunately, but I hate to see it go. It's been a lot of fun, this series, and I hope you've enjoyed it as well. So our final spooky sermon is called The Writing is on the Wall, and we've all heard that saying before. It usually means that something's about to happen, and whatever it is that's about to happen, we're probably not going to like it. Writing on the wall is never a good thing. So the original story, which we just heard, where the saying comes from, is found in the book of Daniel, chapter 5, which we just heard a moment ago. And the events in this chapter take place during the time when the people of the southern kingdom of Judah have been living as captives in Babylon. Now, at this point in the history of God's people who had been living in Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel is gone. They were invaded by the Assyrians about 150 years prior, and they were no longer a nation. Those people were assimilated into countries in the north. The southern kingdom, which included Jerusalem, hung on for a bit longer, but eventually they also were invaded and they were taken to exile into Babylon, leaving behind only the very poorest of the people to keep the land from growing completely wild. And as God had said through the prophets, if the people were unfaithful and worshiped other gods, they would lose their land, and that's what had happened. Now, for this story in Daniel to make any sense to us, I need to share a little bit about the city of Babylon itself. Babylon and the area surrounding it contains some of the oldest human settlements in the world. Civilization there dates back to at least 6,000 BC, probably even back further than that. Compare that to our 250 years. We've got a ways to go yet. The city of Babylon is located on the river Euphrates, and we may remember from history class that that area between the Tigris and the Euphrates was a land called Mesopotamia, which literally means between the rivers. That's where Babylon was on the Euphrates. So it gives us an idea of really how old this part of the civilization and this part of the world was. Today, this part of the world is called Iran, or Iran, depending on how you pronounce it. And the old-fashioned name for it is Persia. And there are many, many things that we have today that come from this ancient civilization. Things like Persian rugs, Persian cats. The Persians invented algebra, backgammon, guitars, the very first postal system, and the very first charter of human rights that was ever written was written by Cyrus the Great, who will become the king of Babylon at the very end of our story today. So the history of this part of the world is pretty amazing, and what a place it would be to visit. But back in the days of Daniel, the people of God were not so crazy about being there. They wanted to go home to Jerusalem. So the prophet Daniel arrived in Babylon with the first wave of the captives. He was a young leader and bright and capable, and he and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, some of you might remember those names from Sunday school a long time ago, they were noticed by King Nebuchadnezzar because they were so good at what they did. They were smart, they served the country well, but when they refused to worship Nebuchadnezzar's gods, the king threw Daniel's friends into a fiery furnace. And God protected them, and they lived. And as a result, King Nebuchadnezzar became a believer in the God of Israel. Now, I don't know that he actually gave up his other gods, but he started to worship Israel's God in addition. And Nebuchadnezzar reigned for about 43 years. So then he passed away. And for the next few years after that, the government of Babylon was a mess. They had a string of 3 rulers in 3 years, relatives of the king who either died or were killed. And so the government was constantly changing hands. It was very unstable. And finally, a king named Nabonidus came to the throne, and the country stabilized, but there was just one problem. Nabonidus didn't particularly like living in Babylon. He wanted to live in Arabia instead, so that's where he went. And he left his son Belshazzar as his regent. That is, he was in charge of Babylon while the king was living away, and the king was away most of the time. So you might say that Belshazzar was sort of the acting king. And that's the guy we were hearing about a moment ago. Belshazzar didn't really care much about the people he ruled. He just enjoyed the perks of being king, and he would invite his rich friends to the palace to eat and drink and have parties, and he gave no thought to the people he was ruling. So as we turn now to the book of Daniel and our reading for today, many decades have passed now since Israel was taken captive, and unknown to most of the people in this story, Jeremiah had left behind a prophecy that God's people would be in exile for 70 years. And that 70 years was now just about up. But most of the people in the story don't know that at this point in time. Daniel knew it, and a few other people, God's people, knew it, but that was it. Belshazzar did not know it, not that he would have been interested anyway. But right about that time, two groups of people, foreigners, the Medes and the Persians, captured a number of the cities around Babylon, and they also captured Belshazzar's father, the king, who was still in Arabia. Now, did Belshazzar try to rescue his dad? No. Belshazzar wasn't afraid, and he wasn't going to go anywhere because he figured that the city of Babylon was unconquerable, so why stick his neck out? And here's why Belshazzar thought Babylon was safe. Check this out. The ancient city of Babylon was 14 square miles surrounded by stone walls. So it was a walled city. And the city didn't have just one wall. It had many walls, like walls within walls, within walls, within walls. And some of those walls were over 300 feet high. That's the length of a football field. And some of the walls were 80 feet thick. So you could put chariots up on the walls to defend the walls. And some of them were so wide you could do 4 chariots wide. And the river Euphrates ran through the city, which had the effect of creating moats in between the walls. So you had wall, water, wall, water, wall, water. So Belshazzar figured he was fine. Nobody was going to get into the city. And to prove to everybody that everyone was safe and everything was going to be fine, while the enemy was approaching the city, Belshazzar held a feast at his palace. And he invited 1,000 of his best friends and their wives and a few hangers-on, so at least 2,000 people, for a feast at the palace. Can you imagine how many animals they killed to feed these people, and how many servants were cooking and serving, and how many skins of wine they drank? John Calvin, the founder of the Presbyterian Church, once said that Belshazzar's carelessness was a sign of his stupidity and also of God's wrath. So if all this wasn't bad enough, as a bad joke, Belshazzar ordered the servants to bring to him the gold and silver vessels that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem so that he and his guests could drink out of them. Now, those of you who are in our Wednesday night Bible study, we just read this past week about those gold and silver vessels. They were created by King Solomon, David's son, created and dedicated to the service of God for the glory of God. These are the same vessels that Nebuchadnezzar took when he captured God's people. And these are the same vessels that Belshazzar called for so he could party with them. Now, this was blasphemy, and people knew it. Nebuchadnezzar had always treated these items with respect. He took good care of them. But Belshazzar handed them out to his friends like they were nothing, and they praised the gods of silver and the gods of gold, and with all the sarcasm they could muster, while drinking from things that were dedicated to the one true and living God. This act of blasphemy set in motion the deliverance of God's people, because all of a sudden Belshazzar and all his guests saw a hand No body attached to it, no arm attached to it, just a hand, writing on the wall behind the king where everybody could see it. And the hand was writing some kind of message, but nobody could read it. And all of a sudden, Belshazzar was not feeling so cocky. He turned pale, and it says his knees literally started knocking together, so he couldn't stand, but he couldn't sit either. And immediately, Belshazzar sent for astrologers and soothsayers, and some versions of the Bible say, and magi. These are the same magi, the same group of religious folks that came to visit the baby Jesus, the same magi. And he says to them, I will make you third in the kingdom, that would be after my father and myself, if you can tell me what this writing says. And none of them could read it. And Belshazzar was terrified. And all of these events created a ruckus in the palace, and apparently the noise came to the ears of the queen because all of a sudden the queen walked into the banquet hall unannounced. Now the queen was the widow of Nebuchadnezzar, not the wife of Belshazzar. And she's one of the few people who had the right to walk into Belshazzar's presence without being invited and to speak to him without his permission. And that's exactly what she did. She greeted him respectfully, and then she reminds him that there's a man in the kingdom named Daniel, who's both a prophet and a man of learning, who will be able to figure out what this writing says. And she says, send for Daniel. Now, at this point, Daniel's probably in his 80s. I mean, he's either retired or semi-retired, and he comes at the queen's request, and Belshazzar points to the handwriting on the wall, and he says, if you can tell me what this means, I will give you all the things that he promised to give the other man. And Daniel answers that he doesn't want any gifts. He doesn't want a reward, but he can and will read the words on the wall. But before he does, he reminds Belshazzar of the greatness of Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom, and how Nebuchadnezzar once went insane when he refused to honor the real God, the God of Israel, that he was actually eating the grass of the fields like an animal, and that his kingdom was restored to him when he finally said Israel's God is the real God. Nebuchadnezzar became sane again when he put his trust in God, and his whole kingdom was restored to him and then some. Now, this is not the first time that Belshazzar had heard this story, but Daniel reminded him of it, and then he says, but you, Belshazzar, you have not humbled yourself, even though you knew all this. You and your lords and their wives and their concubines have been drinking wine from sacred vessels and praising the gods of silver, gold, brass, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see and cannot hear. And the God in whose hand your breath is held, you have not given glory to him. And then Daniel reads the writing on the wall. The words are mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, or parsin, depending on which translation, which literally translated means numbered, weighed, divided. And Daniel explains that this means that Belshazzar's days are numbered. They are now at an end, that he has been weighed in the scales and found wanting, and that the kingdom will be divided this very night between the Medes and the Persians. In fact, even as Daniel is speaking, the invading armies have found a way not over the walls, but under them. And they're getting in that way, and they're approaching the palace at that very moment. Belshazzar knows that Daniel is speaking the truth, and he gives him all the rewards. And within a matter of hours, Belshazzar is dead, and Darius, the leader of the Medes, becomes king temporarily until Cyrus the Great arrives, and then Cyrus begins the restoration of Jerusalem. Cyrus would order finance the return of the people of Judah to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And all these events focus on the rich and the powerful in Babylon. But what about the everyday people, the people who were not rich, the people who were not at the feast, the people who lived in the city. The actions of the great affected them all. So how did life change for them? For the people of Judah, of course, it meant they were going home, if they chose to go home. Following God is always a choice. Some of the people of Judah chose to stay in Babylon, and we don't hear about them again. But most of them chose to return to Jerusalem, and the rest of the Old Testament tells us their story. And because of the decree of Cyrus the Great, about 50,000 people of Judah returned home to rebuild the temple, rebuild the city of Jerusalem. For the average Babylonian, life would improve because Cyrus was a good leader. For years, the people of Babylon had suffered under a king who wanted to be somewhere else. And the son of a king, Belshazzar, who was not very bright, Cyrus was a man who wanted to see the country and its people prosper, and they did. So the writing on the wall, which was spooky when it happened, turned out to be the beginning of God setting things right, God bringing God's people home, and ending the reign of a king who wasn't worthy of the title. So for us today, two things I think we can take home with us. First off, we always want to treat God and the things of God with respect, not taking them for granted or misusing them the way Belshazzar did. The things in a church, the plates, the cups, the crosses, the bread and the wine, things like this, they don't contain God. They're just things, but they are things that are dedicated to the service of the one true and living God. They are here to remind us that God cares about us and has provided for us and wants us to be with God. So we treat these things with respect because they are things that belong to God and are given to us by God. And secondly, whenever we take a look at the world around us and we see trouble, either trouble happening or trouble coming, like that big banquet that Belshazzar held with an invading army on the way, we can be confident that whatever is going wrong in the world, there is a limit to how long the times of trouble will last. God has numbered those days. God is in control. And one day those who bring trouble on God's people will be weighed in the scales and found wanting. So we can read this story of the writing on the wall, either as a warning or as a promise. And either way, we praise God for God's faithfulness from then until now and into our future. Amen.